The Lovecraft mythos is quite a headache to fully grasp. When I first started reading Lovecraft, I wasn't sure where all these Lovecraftian entities interconnected, nor did I know of all the timelines of events that took place in Lovecraft stories. I expected it to be like Lord of the Rings or some other famous fantasy creation, where there is a clear timeline of events and all the characters had backstories neatly lined out. It was only after reading Lovecraft thoroughly and more deeply that I got to better understanding the stories and Lovecraft's thoughts when writing them. In this video, my goal is to help people new to Lovecraft get a better understanding of how his fantasy world works and how the dozens of stories he and others wrote all come together. To start off, even saying Lovecraft's mythos implies that Lovecraft went out of his way to actively create a mythos, that in turn implying a structured fictional universe with an established backstory for each character and so on. This doesn't actually fit in line with what Lovecraft was doing. Nonetheless, it is something that we Lovecraftians and Lovecraft fans use commonly when referring to his collected works. Lovecraft wrote his stories mainly, in my opinion, to express a philosophy or idea, and merely used his settings and characters as devices to better express these ideas. He did not necessarily pay mind to his previous stories or to possible continuity errors when creating newer stories. And because of this, sometimes there are things that are inconsistent or unclear in his stories, especially if you're keeping in mind the idea that there is a structured canon. For example, the title of Elder Things. In At the Mountains of Madness, these creatures are labeled the Elder Things, but are also labeled the Great Old Ones. But the Great Old Ones are in other Lovecraft stories implied to be beings like Cthulhu. Another point would be about how so many of his stories feature the Necronomicon popping up in various places for the protagonist to encounter. Considering that in the mythos it is such a rare book and usually kept in secrecy and under lock and key, it doesn't make much sense, does it? A final point would be about how a few of his stories were basically prototypes of later stories. Look at Dagon and the Call of Cthulhu. Essentially, Call of Cthulhu is a spiritual successor to Dagon. Dagon he wrote in his 20s, and Call of Cthulhu he wrote much later in life. This sort of thing is not in line with someone trying to establish a coherent canon, but rather someone trying to express an idea or a feeling. Lovecraft also encouraged contemporary writers to borrow freely from his literary inventions for their own stories without the thought of financial compensation. He was not a person to care about copyrights and such things. He in turn copied some characters and ideas from other writers, for example Huster, a creation of Ambrose Bierce, and Tsathoggua, a creation of Clark Ashton Smith. All these points really usurp the idea of a structured canon in the Lovecraft mythos. Usually, if a writer or a creator wishes to make a fantasy world, they will take great efforts to avoid all these things Lovecraft did that I just mentioned. So with all that said, to say there is a canon to Lovecraft stories is in my opinion false. The more loose term mythos seems much more fitting to me, although understandably people new to it would expect more structure, as I did when I began reading Lovecraft. Does this mean that any story written by any author using the creations of Lovecraft should be included in the mythos? Is it a case of anything goes? In my opinion,
yeah, sort of anything goes.
No, not anything goes!
Hell no. Some stories or films that I've seen or read are so utterly out of touch with what Lovecraft was all about. Some are comedic or absurdist in tone. Some, for some reason, are even erotic in tone. Imagine what the borderline asexual Lovecraft would think if he saw this. I mean, yeah, tentacles can be sexy sometimes, just ask our Japanese friends. So what makes a story qualify for the mythos? This is such a grey area thing to decide, so I decided to look up some research on what other people thought about this. If we look at, for example, the Lovecraft Wiki article on what is canon, it makes it quite clear that there are numerous opinions on this issue and that no one concrete answer is available. Just look at how long this article is. I highly suggest reading this article after watching this video, as it really does go into a lot more depth than my video will do. I'll link it down below. What the wiki does seem to state is that while there is no solid canon as such, there is a pyramid-like hierarchy when it comes to how valued some contributions to the Lovecraft mythos are. I have to quote Michel Houellebecq's essay here, when he said that the mythos was like an imposing baroque structure with concentric circles. He ranked at the top of this pyramid of Lovecraft's myths his great texts. Then below that, all the other stories written by Lovecraft, such as his earlier works and the less well-acclaimed stories. Then come the stories which Lovecraft participated in. That would be his collaborative works and his ghostwritten works. Lastly come Lovecraft's poems and correspondences with other people. Usually these correspondences included unused ideas and suggestions for other writers to use. Personally, that is how I see it too, but I would also add a layer including the stories written by the likes of Fritz Leiber and Robert Bloch. Some of these stories written by these writers are amazing, even by Lovecraft's own say-so. This doesn't mean that what is stated as fact in the top tier overrides anything that is said in the lower tier literature, merely that the higher the text ranks on this pyramid, the more it is to be valued as being what defines what Lovecraftian horror is. In my very biased opinion, when deciding if a story qualifies to be counted as part of the Lovecraft mythos, it must check a few boxes. 1. Does it adhere to what Lovecraft was going for? He was all about cosmicism, and this should be vital. 2. Does the story respect what was established by Lovecraft? For example, some things are fact in the Lovecraft mythos. Cthulhu does live in Arlia. He does sleep there until the stars right again. Don't retcon him into being a video game final boss or something, or to make him some allegory for Satan, because that's not fitting in line with what Lovecraft established Cthulhu to be. 3. Where are you drawing your inspiration from? Remember the pyramid outlined by Hulbeck? Remember those stories Lovecraft praised and endorsed? These at least show an example of the type of thing that he felt exemplified the ideas that he was aiming for. Considering this mythos we are all fans of is literally named after him, it seems only right to respect these points if we do decide to emulate him, especially so if you're aiming to do a pastiche of his works. In conclusion, there is no official canon to Lovecraft's works, but there does seem to be a hierarchy to the mythos. Rest assured that you can take any of his stories as a standalone story without feeling like you're missing out on the backstory of the characters that you're reading. Adding a tale to the mythos isn't really about ensuring that you do not contradict the origins of the Migo, for example, or checking with some authority if your tale will be canon, nor is it simply paying some company enough money to buy the rights to whatever character you want to write about. It's more about ensuring that cosmic horror and atmosphere are respected. In the end, I don't think there's much need to artistically nitpick the subject, given that Lovecraft never even planned a formal canon or mythos, says the guy who spent 5 hours making this video. Lovecraft was fine with people copying his style and imaginings, but let's not pretend that anything is to be blindly accepted without scrutiny and judgment first. So, do you have what it takes to be a mythos writer? Why not give it a go? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my video. Once again, if there's anything you'd like to add or think I'm wrong on some points, leave a comment and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching and see you around.